Thank you for joining the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for our weekly online ministers forum. I'm the Reverend Dr. Colin Bossen, Senior Minister of the congregation. These programs are conversations with community organizers, scholars, religious leaders, artists, and others about how we can collectively address the current crises. Their purpose is to offer members of our community and all who wish to join us online science-based resources and liberation-oriented inspiration to get us through these difficult times. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Arlie Hochschild, Professor Emerita of the University of California, Berkeley. We'll be reflecting on the events of January 6th, their origins, and what they might portend for the future. Dr. Hochschild is the author of 9 books, including most recently, Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right. It was a finalist for the National Book Award. A path-breaking scholar, Dr. Hochschild has worked to make visible the role of emotion and the work of managing emotion, and is well known for her concept of emotional labor. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm just delighted to be here, Colin.
Well, I think we're going to just start right in with talking about the events of this last week. You've written extensively about the right in the United States, most notably your recent book, or your 2016 book, Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right. And before we dive into some of your overall research about the right, I wonder if you could just begin by offering us an account from your perspective on what happened on January 6th in the nation's capital.
It was an attempted coup. It was a shocker. I think all of us are still absorbing this shock. I think its significance is that it was a stress test for American democracy in 3 different kinds of ways. Most obviously, it was, hey, can the police control a mob and keep them out of the people's house? We did not pass that test. They came in. But it was also a stress test in that our president, first of all, claimed that if the other side won, it was rigged. If he won, that it was not rigged, and sustained this lie, and then knocked on the levers of the institution of democracy. And he challenged the vote in all the states, and lawsuit after lawsuit, over 24 lawsuits, all of which he lost. He challenged the Supreme Court. They believed that this was a fair election, and they threw it out. He challenged the Electoral College, and he even had an hour-long phone call with the Attorney General in Georgia, kind of saying, find me these extra votes. And then he challenged the vice president. So at each point, we can say these are all institutional practices, and that the stress test passed. Actually, it was shocking, but democracy survived. Okay, the police didn't stop the mob, but these institutions stopped a coup. And then I think there's kind of a third stress test to the culture. And I think we haven't very well passed that. The culture of belief, faith in government. If we have 46.9% of Americans who voted for Donald Trump, and half of them believe him when he says that he won the election because he just looked at crowd size and didn't believe in votes, in the realm of belief and in the realm of capacity to encounter one another and engage one another about that belief, in that realm, I think we've really failed. And it points to the big job ahead of us, especially ahead of liberals.
Well, I mean, I think that there's sort of 2 points there that I would like to sort of pick up on. One is sort of the first point about what happened with the Capitol Police and the sort of assault on Congress. One of the things that it sort of reminded me of is the scholar E.P. Thompson talks about how a mob is a moral argument. And I found myself thinking a great deal about that as watching these events unfold. So I don't know whether you agree with E.P. Thompson, but if you do, I'm wondering if you would have some reflections for us on what the sort of moral argument that was being made by this mob.
Yes, I love E.P. Thompson and love his argument and do feel he's right. The moral argument they were, I think, making is we represent America. We're the real Americans. And everyone else, well, they're fake Americans. And there would be Americans there, and they imagine fake votes. So the moral argument is we're authorized, we are entitled, trust us. We carry the symbols of national pride with us. And so that was the argument. And of course, they are, who are they? The Boogaloo Boys, the Proud Boys, the 3%ers who represent a dangerous fringe. They are not the representatives of the people. So that's the argument to and fro. But, you know, it reminds me of another thing, that what Trump has made a stress test of, you know, is it crowd control, it's it institutional arrangements, is it beliefs. He's actually challenged the gravitas, the seriousness of democracy by saying, well, you can just turn the dial. It was a reality show. After all, there was the guy with horns and who'd painted his body, and someone else with his feet up on Nancy Pelosi's desk and stealing a little stationery, but leaving a quarter for it. What is this? This is theater. And in a way, Donald Trump, Mr. Theater, Mr. Circus, is kind of saying, well, that's what democracy is. And you see, we've kind of symbolically, theatrically stage a coup.
So, I mean, I think the seriousness is like an incredibly important point, because I think that like so many things in society have been reduced to kind of this entertainment factor. I mean, you know, I mean, we have, I mean, it's like everybody somehow is supposed to be entertained rather than doing something that is like a serious vocation. I mean, I feel like that's the message that comes from media. That's like the whole idea of a reality TV show on some level, is like,
yeah, that's your identity. It offers an identity. You know, I'm the guy with the horns, right, or that's my identity. Or I'm on TikTok. That's who I am.
Do you think that that's because people have become sort of unmoored from like their, I hate to use the word traditional, but established collective identities? I mean, I feel like that's some of what you write about or researched in Strangers in Their Own Land is sort of this kind of, I'm going to call it unmooring. You probably have more eloquent language.
I love the direction of this questioning, and I like very much the term unmoored. You know, there's a philosopher whose name is Walulis, who wrote a book in which he argued that we've moved from being a society based on marriage and employment to a society based on marriageability and employability. That, you know, in the 1950s, you went to work for, let's say, Kemper Insurance, and your identity was, I'm the guy that gets in my car and I go to the office and I'm number 4 in a certain department at Kemper Insurance. That's what I do, what I care about. I want to do a good job there. And I'm married to my wife, and there was some rebellion at the time from that source of identity, but it was anchoring, it was mooring. And what's happened since the 1970s, I would say, and since offshoring and globalization, in which companies have really won the war with labor unions. Companies have withdrawn a promise of a steady career. So that's gone. And why is it gone? I would say for these reasons. Big players like companies can say, look, you cost too much. Labor's too costly here. I'm going to find some cheap labor pool in the third world and take those jobs away. And so there's a new uncertainty, and what used to be brakes on companies, that would be labor unions on one side and the federal government with regulations on the other, both have eroded. And so there's a loss of promise, of security. So you're working one place, but you don't know if it's a 3-year job, 2-year job. There's an uncertainty and a kind of echo in private life of that. So yes, I think that leaves us vulnerable to picking up, looking for identities of a lighter sort.
Well, it seems to me, I think one of the things you also sort of write about along those lines is the way in which not just sort of employment-based forms or even marriage, but like deep kinship networks and deep, I would call them lifeways or folkways, you might have a different term you want to use, have been just kind of decimated. I mean, I think by these sort of, I get a lot of economists or leftists would call them neoliberal forces, but the sort of larger structures in society, right? And I mean, it seems to me that with the moral argument of the kind of mob that descended onto the Congress, part of that was almost like, give us back, take back our country, make America great again. We want these things back. Though the irony, for me at least, watching that was so much of the kind of folkway, or what we might want to call it, on display on January 6th was sort of an imitation, a character act, a performance of some of these older sensibilities rather than the actual content of them.
Yes, I like that very much. And, I should say that in the community that I got to know, the communities over 5 years in southern Louisiana, which turned out to be a powerful base for Donald Trump enthusiasm. These were strong communities, actually. They were people went to church. I went to church with them, to a variety of churches, a lot of Pentecostal church, Baptist church, especially some Methodist, Catholic. And you go to the door and there would be someone right there. Hi, how are you, Elma? Good to see you this Sunday. And there is, I think, more community in these right-wing areas than I felt actually in the more cosmopolitan urban setting that I've grown up with. So I think actually progressives often talk a lot about community, but they have less of it than blue-collar stayer communities. They don't leave, they stay. And most of the people that I came to write about in Strangers in Their Own Land are living pretty close to where they were born and where they would be buried. Mm. And very close to their kin. They complain about the kin, but they were close in there. So it's not a loss story, but it is what they value. And then that they feel very detached from Washington, D.C., or even the next town down the road, Baton Rouge. Well, that's where the state government is. Oh, that's those people in Baton Rouge, that's another world. So they're locals, and they feel fiercely proud of that and put down by the urban cosmopolitans. I mean, that is a thread that's really going on here.
I think maybe sort of thinking a little bit more about Trump and Trumpism. There was a recent article in The Atlantic by Derek Thompson where he describes your work on the right and how you've developed a narrative of what's happened over the last several years. And you sort of divide the Trump presidency into 4 chapters. The line, the arrival, the suffering, and the afterlife. So could you kind of walk us through that kind of narrative?
Yes. I start with the idea that you get to the heart of a person's political persuasion through a metaphor that expresses a situation which feels deep and true and important to you. And I call it a deep story. What is a deep story? You take facts out of a deep story. This isn't about facts. You take moral precepts out. It's not about that either. It's about what feels true, and you tell it by a metaphor. And for me, we all have deep stories, left, right, and center, but the right deep story is told by a picture of a man standing in line, and his shoes are faced forward, and there's a line ahead of him. As in a pilgrimage, the top of the hill is the American dream. His feet are tired. He hasn't moved in a long, long time. One guy said, I haven't had a raise in 2 decades. And he says to himself, look, I've worked hard. I deserve to get the American dream. I'm not mad at anybody, and I'm not prejudiced. It's just that I'm waiting in line. These are the rules. And in the first moment of the right-wing deep story, someone sees someone cutting ahead in line. I feel that's unfair. And who's cutting ahead? It's African Americans who are finally, through federally mandated affirmative action, being given access to jobs that had been always reserved for whites, even worse, women such as myself, who are finally given access to jobs that had been reserved for men. He's just seen as line cutters. And then asylum seekers, undocumented immigrants, and even in the case of Louisiana, where environmental laws are very lax and have led to the extinction of the state bird, the brown pelican. There's this oil-soaked brown pelican, and he seems to be cutting ahead in line through the imposition of environmental regulations of polluters that they presume are taking jobs away from them. And a lot of people said, oh, those environmentalists, they're animists, they worship animals. So all these line cutters, and then another moment of the right-wing deep story, there's Barack Obama, who seems to be waving to the line cutters. Oh, he's their president. He's pushing us back and not acknowledging us or helping us. And then in the final moment, the deep story, and remember that the guy is not looking back at the miles and miles of people behind him. He's just looking at the few people ahead of him, between him and the American dream, envying them. And one of them, more highly educated, closer to the American dream, turns around, faces him and says, you, backward, ill-educated, prejudiced, sexist, racist, anti-gay, bigot, you redneck. And the contempt of that is the last straw. It then feels like I am a stranger, culturally, economically, demographically. I'm a stranger in my own land. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2 arrives the deep story president. That would be Donald Trump saying, no, you're not a stranger in your own land. This is your land. I'm giving it back to you. Okay, you're home with me. So that's chapter 2. Chapter 3 is, but wow, I'm suffering for you. I'm suffering for you.
The I here being Donald Trump.
Yes, I being Donald Trump, right. And borrowing a kind of a Christian kind of notion of suffering. I'm taking suffering off of yourself. I'm putting it back on myself and doing it for you. And people are thinking, oh, we need him. He's also in this moment, this chapter 3 of the deep story for the right. He's also taking shame off them because that's a hidden part of this story. And we have to look at the feeling, the emotion of shame. Mm-hmm. It's not warranted for blue collar workers who are suffering from automation on one hand and offshoring on another. Their fate, no matter how hard they work, has gotten harder. It really has. But in America, where the faith is in individualism, you think, well, if you succeed, that's to your credit. But if you fail, that's your shame. And Donald Trump has, in this moment of suffering for us, he's also saying, look, I'm taking shame off your shoulders. I'm getting rid of it. I'm giving you pride instead. And I'm giving you someone to blame for the pinch you're in. So that is kind of the emotional moves he's made. In the next chapter, very recent, he's saying, okay, I've suffered for you. Now you suffer for me. You come forward. And I don't mean this in real terms, but it's kind of an onward Christian soldiers. Okay, you are now the soldiers in my army because I am your Christ. And I think that is the imagery that's being played on, and that's drawing people emotionally to him and binding their loyalty to this person. But the truth behind it is that many people told me, we don't see anything else for us, nothing plausible. And I think that's the lesson to learn here. I began this book, with a red state paradox. How come all the red states, the Republican states, are the poor states with lots of problems and take more money from the federal government than they give to it, and tax dollars, and hate the government? I don't understand that. Louisiana was an exaggerated version of just that. So that I entered with that problem, but I exited with the sense of, wait, no, there's a blue state paradox. How come the party, the Democratic Party, party of the working man and working woman, has no appeal, isn't offering something to the very people they hope to represent?
Well, I mean, I think that it seems to me like so much of the story that you're thinking about or telling has sort of these kind of almost two layers to it. There's a sort of deep structural layer story that is not being told at all, which is the story of the neoliberal economy and the vast concentration of wealth and the destruction of traditional lifeways, which is not, I mean, Trump talks about them in some ways, but he doesn't give people a real set of analytical tools to say, you're being marginalized by these giant corporations that don't have your interest at heart. He's pointing the finger instead at, well, people like you and me, or people, as the
immigrants, blacks, yeah.
Right. So, there's that on the one level, and then there's sort of how do people make emotional sense of this? And one of the things when you sort of were talking earlier about sort of the 3 points you had, or 3 observations you had about the invasion of or the attempted coup on January 6th was, well, there's, and I'm just going to use a philosophical word and then spell it out a little bit here, but there's an epistemological crisis, right? Like we sort of are in this world where, so epistemology is the theory of knowledge. How do we know things? What do we know? What is knowable? What isn't knowable? Right? And so there's now this crisis where everybody has sort of different understandings of what the truth is, how we might obtain the truth, where we can go to for the truth, and that feeds into sort of this story. So somebody like myself, who has, read a lot, thought a lot, been around unions my whole life, has a sort of analysis that comes from, well, so much of this is generated by, we could be crass and call it capitalism or corporate greed or the sort of neoliberal economic structure, and tick, 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 go through the whole, how that is played out, but I think that the people you're talking about for various different reasons don't necessarily have, and I don't know whether we want to say it's access, whether it's in a community around them that is encouraging that kind of conversation. But there is this sort of huge just disjuncture, right? I mean, there's this horrifying moment in assault on the Capitol that I read from one of the New York Times reporters, who basically is like, I was afraid I was going to be killed because I was a New York Times journalist.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And I mean, I have all sorts of problems with the New York Times that go back, you know, most of my adult life, and choices that they've made around covering this or putting out narratives around, well, particularly around Bush's wars of choice, for instance. But, you know, I mean, like, I know people who work for the Times. I think of sort of like it is a generally like pretty good source of information. I mostly trust most of the information that, you know, comes out of it, think critically about it, and would never be like, you journalists are the enemy of the people, which is of course a phrase that Trump used that has a long history within totalitarianism. And like, you must be killed. And yet for, you know, so many of the people who are involved in these kind of right-wing movements right now, that's a source of falsehood, a source of evil.
You know, when I first went to Lake Charles and began to get to know the Tea Party enthusiasts, I thought, well, I'm not just in a community, I'm in a new truth.
Mm.
It was, as you say, it calls for us to think about epistemology. I mean, they had their own epistemology, and it's as if when we have a deep story, and all of us do have deep stories. I know about mine. I think it involves a magnet. There are positive and negative magnets attached to our stories, so that we want certain pieces of knowledge and resist other pieces of knowledge. And as I read the paper, I catch it in my own self. Oh, I don't want to read about that. You know, oh, more bad news there. No, let me go for this page. And when I think there is an art that we all need to develop, a kind of a discipline that requires us to take our moral and political alarm system off temporarily, so that you can be actively curious about people who really live in a different epistemology, and you try and get the hang of theirs, that's the purpose of your deep listening.
Mm-hmm.
And then you come back and you say, okay, I kind of see where they're coming from. Don't agree with it, but we all need to be able to do that. I think it takes a kind of an emotional labor of a researcher, of a curious person. We can all do it. No one's better at it than anyone else, but we're not trying to do that. We're living within our epistemological cocoons and defensively. And I think maybe especially liberals are doing this because we're worried that now we're the strangers in our own land.
Well, I mean, I think that disjuncture between, I mean, there's The Great Sort, which is that book. I'm forgetting the author right now, but, you know, that came out several years ago about how people sort of are now sorting according to party affiliation and ideology almost as much as anything
That's right.
Else.
Cost of real estate, yeah.
Right. You know, that this question of like, who do you build community with, to sort of go back to the community question. I mean, one thing that I found myself thinking about when I was looking at Strangers in a Strange Land, and also, or sorry, Strangers in their own land, not Robert Heinlein. And I spent about 10 years on and off doing human rights work in Chiapas, Mexico, which is a rural, very poor, I mean, it's actually probably, well, it used to be the poorest area in the Western Hemisphere. I don't know whether that's still true or whether it's, now just one of the two or three, where there was a revolutionary movement called the Zapatista movement that had, risen up in arms and actually taken control of part of the state. And the thing that is interesting to me about that and resonated is so many of the stories that were being recounted in Strangers in Their Own Land sounded like sort of, the same kinds of narratives that I would hear when I would go spend time in these peasant communities. And I don't use the word peasant pejoratively. I mean, they were literally
farming.
Right. Communities in southern Mexico. And the thing, though, that is different is the sort of political orientation, because the Zapatistas are the sort of very far left, radical, anarcho-communist, even political movement, right? And it just seemed to come down to like almost like what political classes had invested energy into trying to build a relationship with these communities, right? So the Zapatista story, which you may be familiar with, I doubt most of our listeners, viewers are, but the Zapatista story is that basically the movement was a marriage, if you will, between the sort of urban Marxist guerrillas and long-standing indigenous community leaders, right? And in the early 1980s, this radical Marxist group came from the cities, Mexico City, which is, like New York, if you've ever been to Mexico and literally like New York in so many ways, this vast cosmopolitan city. And spent 20 years organizing in these communities and really helped them to develop an analysis of like, who's the problem here? What is the problem? Who is your enemy? Who cares about you? Who's what's your deep story? And I don't see, I could be wrong, but I don't see anybody effectively on what I'll call the left in the United States sort of making a similar investment in the communities that you're describing in Louisiana. The people who seem to be making that investment are folks on the right. I mean, there are like lots of other people who are making investments in, say, Stacey Abrams' brilliant work in Georgia, right? I mean, like a huge investment in African-American voters and communities there. But I don't see, and I do not pretend to be omniscient, but, I don't see, a similar investment being made in rural Louisiana and white communities in rural Louisiana by any sort of political class on the left in the United States.
I think that's a very keen observation. I'm now doing interviews in a mixed project in Appalachia. And there, coal is was the big industry, just as oil was in southern Louisiana. And there too, the right wing is very, very strong. And there too, just 2 or 3 generations back, or 2 or 3 decades back, most people were Democrats, and they were Democrats because of the powerful labor movement and the United Mine Workers that got them the 8-hour day and got them some recompense for black lung and got them off of the script system, which are paid only in a currency you have to spend there in the coal community by the company store, so on. So the unions were had a different narrative, and that look, these why is Louisiana or why is Kentucky a poor state and have really poor schools and poor clinics? It's because the coal companies have taken the profits out and left us with chopped off mountains and contaminated water and a story of exploitation. So there was a narrative. And interestingly, a young woman explained to me the origin of the term redneck. I had thought the origin was that you were an agricultural worker, and so you were out in the sun and your neck became red because of that. She said, no, she didn't think so, that in the era of powerful United Mine Workers in these coal mines where there was a big fight going on between the union and the company, the workers received a red kerchief. And if you were wearing it, it meant you weren't a scab laborer. It meant that you were on strike, and it was clear who you were, and that workers were black and white, and there were foreigners that had been brought in actually with the purpose of dividing the loyalty of workers, but it didn't. The union brought people together, you know. You're not black, you're white, you're a worker or a not worker. And that a red neck meant that you were pro-diversity and pro-union. So completely reversing the meaning of redneck today. So that just goes back a few decades to a history. I guess what we can say is that an epistemology, a truth, a narrative, a story has to have some people that are advocating it and offering a better life to the people who are listening to it.
Yeah, I feel like we could go on for a very long time and continue to have a very interesting conversation, but I do want to be mindful of people's time, and I want to sort of wrap up with kind of like the big question from this last week, which is just, you know, there are a lot of people, particularly those affiliated with the Democratic Party or the left, or those who hold views like Mitt Romney and represent, I hesitate to call them the moderate wing of the Republican Party, but a particular vision of the Republican Party that is not involved in taking over the Capitol, who are asking the question, how can what happened on January 6th be prevented from happening again? Especially today, I have to say, when like the news keeps coming out of, you know, there are these plans to invade capitals, the state capitals. There is real concern about what's going to happen on Inauguration Day. So what is your perspective on this question? How can what happened on January 6th be prevented from happening again?
Well, I think there needs to arise a leadership that says, look, we're against this violence. This isn't how you do democracy. This is an undemocratic way of your claims of democracy are false if you have a gun and tote it to a state capitol. I'm saying the obvious, but that leaders of goodwill, moderates on both sides of the aisle need to come together. I think it can be done. I know that precisely cooperation across the parties is what's been toxified. But I just, if you look at Nelson Mandela and the great leaders that pulled us out of the fire of violence and death, they were people who were very good at reaching across to the other side. Mandela did his negotiations in South Africa under apartheid. And he did it in Afrikaans. He knew those he had the profoundest of differences with. So I call on us to look to the great leaders in the world who've overcome violence with a certain kind of moral strength and a capacity to see the world from other points of view.
So empathy is where we need to start.
That's right. That's right.
Well, I think that since this is ostentatiously a church forum, empathy is a great point on which to end, since I think that as a religious community, we are called to be empathetic, as perhaps one of our great callings is to be empathetic and to learn how to see the pain of others through our own eyes. Absolutely.
Even if the pain is expressed in a voice you differ from. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And for our viewers, if you found this video to be helpful, I hope you'll consider joining us for our weekly online worship service, which are posted each Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Central and feature music and prayers in addition to a sermon. This weekend, of course, is Martin Luther King Sunday, and I will be talking about the legacy of the radical King. For those of you who joined us for the first time, let me say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. We're a religious tradition that celebrates the possibility of goodness within each human heart, the transformative power of love, and the clarifying force of reason. We believe that we need not think alike to love alike. I'd like to thank our staff for making this video possible. It's produced by Christian Holmes. Alma Vizcarra assisted with the editing. We'll see you all online soon and in person as soon as we can gather again. And please remember that no matter how isolated you feel, we're all in this together. And special thanks again to our fabulous guest, Dr. Hochschild.
Lovely.